The contractor's hammer hit the plaster and the sound was wrong. Not a dull thud, not the crack of old lath. Something solid. Solid wood. Frank pulled the claw end back and struck again. This time the drywall crumbled in a fist-sized hole. He leaned in close. He saw wood grain, old oak, a vertical frame, the edge of a door. Frank wiped the dust from his forehead. He had been swinging a hammer for 14 years. He had torn down walls in houses built before the Civil War. He had found old newspapers stuffed between studs for insulation. He had found dead squirrels. He had found rusted pipes and abandoned wasp nests. He had never found a door sealed behind plaster in a wall that wasn't supposed to have anything on the other side. He called up to his foreman. Pete came climbing the attic stairs, muttering about the low ceiling and the heat. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, had been doing this work since he was 18. He looked at the hole Frank had made. He looked at Frank. "You hit a stud," he said. "Keep going." Frank shook his head. He reached his hand through the hole. His fingers traced the edge of the doorframe. He found a hinge, thick and rusted. He found the smooth metal of a handle on the other side. He looked at Pete. "There's a door here," he said. "A whole door." They started pulling down more drywall. The plaster came away in chunks. The lath was old and brittle. Within 20 minutes, they had exposed the full door. It was solid oak, maybe 3 inches thick, heavy, the kind of door you'd find on an old bank vault, and it was sealed with a padlock, a large master lock, rusted orange-brown, with a chain looped through a hasp bolted to the frame. The keyhole was crusted with corrosion. Pete called the homeowner. Emily came up the stairs. She was a young woman in her early 30s, a graphic designer from Philadelphia. She had bought the house with her husband Mark 6 months earlier. They had fallen in love with the Victorian architecture, the high ceilings, the old woodwork. She had no idea this door existed. The inspection report had mentioned nothing. The realtor had never said a word. Emily stared at the door. "What is it?" she asked. Frank said he didn't know. Pete called the Millbrook Police Department. The dispatcher logged it as a suspicious structure. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes. One was a young patrolman named Harris. He was new to the force, fresh out of the academy. The other was Sergeant Cole. He was a veteran, had been working in Millbrook for 22 years. He climbed the stairs and shone his flashlight on the door. He looked at the padlock. He looked at the oak door. He didn't say anything at first, then he said, "I remember this house." He remembered the Miller case. He had been a rookie in 1990. He had been one of the first officers on the scene when the 8-year-old boy vanished from the basement. He had searched the house himself. He had stood in the basement and looked at the locked window and wondered how a child could just disappear. He had never been back inside since. He had never had a reason to, until now. Sergeant Cole called Sheriff Danvers. "You need to come out here," he said. "We have something in the attic, behind a false wall, sealed with a lock. Looks like it's been there for decades." Danvers came himself. He was a tall man with a grey beard nearing retirement. He had been sheriff for 18 years. He knew the Miller case well. It had haunted him. Danvers brought bolt cutters. He cut the padlock. The chain clattered to the attic floor. He pushed the door open. The air that came out was cold and dry. It smelled like dust and old cotton and something else, something faintly metallic. Rust, maybe, or old blood. The room was small, 10 feet by 8 by his estimate. A narrow iron bed against the far wall. Rusted springs poking through a thin mattress. A wooden desk beside it. On the desk, a Sega Genesis console. Black plastic, faded grey from sunlight that had never reached it. Game cartridges stacked in a neat pile. Sonic the Hedgehog. Streets of Rage. A baseball game. A racing game. On the floor, a pair of small sneakers, blue and white, scuffed at the toes. A blue jacket hung on a hook, children's size. And taped to the wall were drawings, stick figures, a house with a red roof, a sun with a smiley face. At the bottom, in the unsteady handwriting of a young child, David, 1990. Sergeant Cole stepped back. His face went pale. He looked at Sheriff Danvers. "That's the Miller boy," he said. "The one who vanished from the basement 36 years ago. He was here the whole time." Danvers called the FBI. He told them they had found a sealed room with children's belongings and a Sega Genesis from 1990. He told them the room was in the Miller house. He told them Richard Miller had owned the house until he died in 2023. The FBI Cold Case Division sent a team within hours. Special Agent Elena Martinez led the investigation. She was a veteran with 15 years of cold case experience. She had solved disappearances that had gone cold for decades. She walked into that attic and understood immediately what she was looking at. The room was a prison. The bed had leather straps attached to the frame, rusted buckles still intact. A metal bucket in the corner with a lid. No window, no ventilation. Just a space where a child had been kept. A desk with a false bottom. Agent Martinez pried it open. She found a black leather journal. The cover was worn. The pages were filled with neat, cramped handwriting. The first entry was dated July 1990. The last entry, March 1994. Richard Miller's journal. She opened it and began to read. Her team gathered around. The attic was silent except for the turning of pages. The first entry, July 12th, 1990. I have decided to begin the project. David has become too independent. He questions my authority. He talks back. He needs to learn discipline. I will build a place where he can understand what happens to those who do not obey. The journal described the construction, how Richard had worked on it in secret, late at night while Susan slept, how he had soundproofed the walls with extra layers of plaster and insulation, how he had installed a hidden latch that only he could operate from the outside, how he had planned every detail. Another entry, August 3rd, 1990. The frame is complete. I soundproofed the walls. I installed the lock. I have the key. Susan will never go into the attic. She is afraid of the dust. She is afraid of spiders. She will never find it. Agent Martinez looked at her team. She had seen many terrible things in her career. She had read confessions from serial killers and rapists. This was different. This was a methodical, cold-blooded plan to imprison a child. And it had succeeded. For years, decades. The journal detailed the day of the disappearance, December 14th, 1990. Richard wrote, "The day has arrived." David was playing in the basement. Susan was cooking. I called him up to the garage. I told him I had a surprise. He followed me to the attic. He thought it was a game. He was excited. I showed him the room. He asked if it was a new playroom. I told him it was. I told him to go inside. He did. I locked the door. He screamed. I told him to be quiet. I told him I would kill his mother if he didn't obey. He became silent. The journal continued over the next 3 years. Richard documented every day of David's captivity, what he ate, what he was given to read, how he reacted, the punishments, the crying, the begging, the times David tried to reason with him. Richard wrote that David eventually gave up hope. He said the boy had accepted his fate and become quiet and obedient. And then, March 14th, 1994, the last entry. I am leaving for the conference. David is quiet. He has been working on something with his hands. I don't know what. I will check when I return. There was no entry after that. Richard had returned to an empty room. He had written nothing else. He had simply stopped journaling and sealed the room. The door had remained locked for 32 more years. Agent Martinez called the Portland FBI field office. She instructed them to find Daniel Ross. But to understand how that room came to be sealed, you have to go back. Back to the winter of 1990. Back to the moment when a mother stood at the top of her basement stairs calling her son's name. That mother was Susan Miller. She was 32 years old. She had a gentle face and soft brown eyes. She worked part-time as a receptionist at the local dental office. She had struggled for years to conceive. David was her miracle child. He was born after 3 miscarriages. She had held him in her arms and wept with joy. On December 14th, 1990, at about 5:30 p.m., Susan was in the kitchen making meatloaf. The kitchen was warm and steamy. The windows were fogged from the boiling potatoes. David was in the basement, as he always was after school. He had a Sega Genesis down there. His father, Richard, had bought it for him on his birthday. David loved Sonic the Hedgehog. He would play for hours, eyes glued to the screen, his small fingers working the controller. Susan mixed the ground beef, the breadcrumbs, the chopped onion. She added Worcestershire sauce and an egg. She formed the loaf and slid it into the oven. She set the timer for 45 minutes. She called down the stairs. "David, dinner in about 20 minutes." She heard his voice echo back. "Okay, Mom." She heard the video game sounds. The familiar beeps and boops of Sonic running through Green Hill Zone. She smiled and went back to the stove. She stirred the gravy. She checked the potatoes, poking them with a fork. She set the table. 3 plates, 3 glasses. She was looking forward to a quiet evening. David had been doing well in school. His teacher had called that afternoon to say he was reading above grade level. Susan was proud. At 6:10, she called again. "David, come up and wash your hands for dinner." No answer. She called louder. "David." Silence, only the hum of the furnace. She walked to the top of the basement stairs. She listened. Nothing. She went down. The basement was finished. Carpet, drywall, a small couch, a TV on a wooden stand. The Sega Genesis was on the floor, still running. The screen showed a paused game. Sonic was frozen mid-jump. The controller was lying beside it, as if David had dropped it and walked away. Susan picked up the controller. It was warm from his hand. She called his name again. "David, where are you?" She checked the laundry room. She checked the furnace closet. She checked the crawl space behind the water heater. She opened the storage cabinets. Nothing. She looked at the basement window. It was a small casement window, maybe 18 inches wide and 2 feet tall. She had locked it that morning. She checked it now. It was locked. The latch was secure, no broken glass, no signs of forced entry. Her heart started pounding. A cold wave washed over her. She ran up the stairs. She called for Richard. He was in his workshop in the garage. He came in, wiping grease from his hands. He was a tall man with a thin mustache and a quiet demeanor. He rarely raised his voice. He walked to the basement. He looked around. He opened the closet doors. He looked behind the furnace. "He's not here," Richard said. "Did you see him leave?" Susan shook her head. "I was upstairs the whole time. He never came up. I would have heard him." Richard looked at her. His eyes were flat. "Maybe he went out the front door while you were in the kitchen. I would have seen him. I was in the kitchen. The front door is right there. He would have walked past me." Richard said nothing. He walked to the front door. It was locked from the inside. He checked the back door. Locked. He checked the side door to the garage. Locked. He came back to the kitchen. "Call the police," he said. Susan dialed 911 at 6:47 p.m. Her voice was shaking. She told the dispatcher her son was missing. She gave the address. She said he was 8 years old. She said he was wearing blue jeans and a green sweater. She said he had been in the basement. She said the doors were all locked. The dispatcher told her to stay calm, help was on the way. But Susan couldn't stay calm. She was already imagining the worst. The first deputy arrived at 7:02. Deputy Mike Rawlings was a burly man with a crew cut and a calm demeanor. He took Susan's statement in the kitchen. She was sobbing into her hands. She kept repeating, "He was right there. I was only upstairs for 20 minutes." Rawlings wrote everything down in his notebook. He asked Richard the same questions. Richard gave short, clipped answers. He said he had been in the garage workshop. He said he heard nothing unusual. He said David was a difficult child, but he didn't think he would run away. Rawlings searched the basement again. He crawled into the crawl space. Cobwebs clung to his face. He found only dust and old boxes. He checked the window again. Locked. He checked the floor for any trapdoors. Nothing. He walked outside and circled the house. The ground was frozen. No footprints, no tire tracks. The snow was undisturbed. Within an hour, the state police arrived with a K9 unit. The bloodhound, a male named Bosco, sniffed David's jacket. He circled the basement. He followed the scent to the stairs. He went up the stairs, through the kitchen to the front porch. At the porch steps, the trail stopped. Bosco circled. He whined. He put his nose to the ground and circled again. The handler said it was like David had just vanished, or been carried, or walked backward. By midnight, the sheriff's department had set up a command post in the Millers' living room. They interviewed neighbors. The neighbors on either side had seen nothing. The family across the street said they had been watching television and saw no one leave the Miller house. A woman walking her dog at 5:30 said she saw a man in a brown coat near the Miller's driveway, but she couldn't describe him. She wasn't sure it was that day. The search began at dawn. Dozens of volunteers gathered at the Millbrook Fire Department. They were given maps and assigned sectors. They combed the frozen fields outside town. They walked the railroad tracks kicking through snow. They searched the creek bed. One volunteer found a red mitten, but it was too large. Another found a child's sneaker, 3 sizes too big. Each find brought a moment of hope. Each hope collapsed. Susan Miller stayed in the basement that night. She refused to leave. She sat on the floor holding her son's jacket. She prayed until her voice was hoarse. She rocked back and forth. She told the officers she would stay until David came home. Richard stood at the top of the stairs. He did not go down. He told the officers he needed to be alone. He went to his workshop and closed the door. On December 16th, the FBI arrived. Special Agent Paul Harrington was a lean, gray-haired man with a quiet intensity. He had worked child abductions before. He knew the statistics. He knew the first 48 hours were critical. He interviewed Susan for 3 hours. He asked about David's habits, his friends, any recent changes. She said he was a happy child, a little shy, but he had never run away. He was afraid of the dark. He never went outside after sunset. Harrington interviewed Richard. Richard sat in the living room with his hands clasped. He spoke in a monotone. He described David as willful and disobedient. He said he had grounded David a week earlier for not doing his chores. He said David had been upset, but had accepted the punishment. Harrington asked about discipline. Richard said he was firm but fair. He never mentioned spanking. He never mentioned the attic. He never mentioned any room. Harrington studied Richard's face. There was no tremor, no flicker of emotion. He was too calm. But Harrington had interviewed hundreds of grieving parents. Some were stoic, some were in shock. He couldn't make a judgment based solely on demeanor. He asked Richard to take a polygraph test. Richard agreed. He passed. The examiner noted that his responses were consistent. He showed no signs of deception. Later, it would be discovered that Richard had practiced the polygraph. He had read books on how to beat it. He had prepared for months. The FBI checked the basement floor plans. They measured the walls. They noted the ceiling height was 8 feet. They saw no indication of a second floor above. They didn't think to measure the attic. The attic was large, but it was used for storage. Susan had been up there once or twice. Richard did most of the storage. She had no reason to suspect anything. By Christmas, the case had been classified as a probable stranger abduction, a child snatched from a locked basement. Impossible. But stranger things had happened. The FBI distributed posters across the state. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with David's photo. The Millbrook community held a candlelight vigil in the town square. Susan Miller stood in the snow, holding a candle, crying. Richard stood beside her. His eyes were dry. The weeks turned to months. Susan organized more searches. She called the FBI every day. She called the state police. She hired a private investigator named Walter Crane. Crane was a former FBI agent with 30 years of experience. He reviewed the case file. He interviewed the neighbors again. He drove to the Miller house and walked the perimeter. He went into the basement. He studied the window. He took measurements. He asked Susan if there were any crawl spaces or hidden rooms. She said no. She had never seen any. Crane spent 6 weeks on the case. He found nothing. He told Susan he believed it was a stranger abduction. He said the only way a child could disappear from a locked room was if someone had a key. He asked if anyone else had a key to the house. Susan said only her and Richard. Crane asked to interview Richard again. Richard refused. He said he had already answered all questions. He said the investigator was wasting his time. Crane dropped the case. He told Susan he was sorry. He said he had no leads. He said he would continue to monitor new developments. Susan thanked him and paid his fee. She didn't have much money. Richard controlled the finances. She had to ask him for the check. He gave it to her without comment. The first anniversary of David's disappearance arrived. Susan stood in the basement. She had placed a small memorial on the shelf, a framed photo of David, a candle, A teddy bear. Richard found her there. He told her to stop. He said it was morbid. He said she needed to let go. Susan left the memorial anyway. She would not let go. In the summer of 1991, the Miller family went on a vacation to Lake Erie. Richard insisted. He said they needed a break. Susan went along reluctantly. She spent the week staring at the water. She kept imagining David running along the beach. She kept hoping she would see his face in the crowd. She didn't. Neighbors noticed that Richard rarely spoke about David. In public, he would change the subject. He would talk about work. He would talk about the weather. He would talk about anything except his missing stepson. Some thought he was grieving in his own way. Others thought he was cold. The Millbrook Police Department had a file on Richard, but it was thin. He had no criminal record. He had no history of violence. He was a respected accountant. But there was one neighbor who remembered something odd. Her name was Martha Hayes. She was an elderly woman who lived 2 doors down. She spent most of her time in her garden. She told investigators in 1990 that she had seen Richard carrying large bags of construction material into the house in the months before David vanished. She thought he was renovating. She didn't think anything of it at the time. She never saw him bring anything out. Another neighbor, a retired mechanic named Frank Bellamy, said he had heard hammering coming from the Miller house on several evenings. But the Miller house was old. It always had repair needs. He didn't find it suspicious. He did notice that Richard always closed the garage door quickly, as if he didn't want anyone to see what was inside. The FBI never interviewed these neighbors deeply. They focused on the abduction theory. They assumed David had been taken by a stranger. They didn't consider that he might have been hidden inside the house. It was too unthinkable. Susan Miller continued to call the Millbrook police every week. She asked for updates. She asked if they had searched the woods again. She asked if they had checked the landfill. She asked if they had used ground-penetrating radar. The detective assigned to the case, Detective Dan Fowler, listened patiently each time. He told her the case was still open. He told her they had no new leads. He told her to keep hoping. But even he had stopped believing. Fowler had been a young detective in 1990. He had worked the Miller case from the beginning. He had interviewed the neighbors. He had walked the fields. He had spent sleepless nights reviewing the evidence. He had a theory that Richard was involved, but he could never prove it. He requested a search warrant for the house in 1992. The judge denied it. There was not enough probable cause. Richard had passed a polygraph. There was no physical evidence. The warrant was denied. Fowler carried that denial with him for the rest of his career. He often visited Susan. He would sit in her kitchen and drink coffee. He would listen to her talk about David. He would tell her he was still looking. He was. He never stopped. He reviewed the file every year on the anniversary. He looked for new angles. He looked for new witnesses. He found nothing. The case haunted him. It followed him home. His wife said he talked in his sleep. He would mutter David's name. By 1993, Susan began to lose hope. She started drinking in the evenings. She would sit in the kitchen with a glass of wine and stare at the basement door. She would replay that day in her mind over and over. She would wonder what she could have done differently. Richard would come in, take the glass from her, and tell her to go to bed. She would go. She would cry into her pillow. He would sleep beside her, silent. In the summer of 1994, Susan began seeing a therapist. The therapist suggested she write letters to David. She wrote dozens of letters. She told him about the garden. She told him about the golden retriever she had gotten, named Buddy. She told him how much she missed him. She sealed each letter in an envelope and put them in a box in her closet. She never mailed them. She didn't have an address. She never knew that at that very time David was still in the house. He was in the attic, in that hidden room. He was 14 years old. He had been there for nearly 4 years. He had grown. His clothing no longer fit. Richard would bring him new clothes every few months. He would bring books. He would bring food. David was allowed out of the room once a day to use the bathroom, but only at night when Susan was asleep. David had no window, no clock. He measured time by Richard's visits. Morning, noon, evening. He knew when it was winter because Richard brought a heavy blanket. He knew when it was summer because the attic grew hot. He tried to keep his sanity by reciting multiplication tables in his head. He wrote in a small notebook with a pencil stub Richard gave him. He drew pictures of the house, the garden, his mother. He missed her so much it was a physical pain. He remembered his mother's voice. He remembered the sound of her footsteps on the stairs. He could hear her sometimes through the attic floor. He would press his ear to the floorboards and listen. He heard her crying. He heard her talking to Richard. He wanted to scream. He wanted to pound on the walls. But he knew Richard would hurt him. He knew Richard would lock the room and leave him in the dark for days. He stayed quiet. David had one small window of hope, a tiny crack in the attic floorboards where he could see a sliver of the hallway below. Sometimes he would see his mother walk past. He would see her feet. He would see the hem of her dress. He would whisper her name. She never heard him. The floorboards were too thick. The sound was too faint. But he kept whispering. He kept hoping. Richard would bring him books from the library, history books, science books, novels. David read everything. He read the same books over and over. He memorized passages. He recited poetry to himself. He did math problems in his head. He kept his mind sharp. He knew that one day he would escape. He had to be ready. He studied the lock. He studied Richard's habits. He watched through the crack in the floorboards. He learned the pattern of Richard's footsteps. He learned when Richard was relaxed and when he was tense. He learned that Richard was most careless after he had been drinking. Richard would come to the attic room with a bottle of whiskey. He would sit in the chair and talk. He would tell David about his day. He would complain about Susan. He would complain about work. David listened. He learned everything. He learned that Richard had a key to the room on a chain around his neck. He learned that Richard slept with the key under his pillow. He learned that Richard kept a spare key in his workshop. He learned where it was hidden. He made a mental note. He filed it away. He waited. On the night of March 15th, 1994, Richard told David he would be gone for 2 days. An accounting conference in Harrisburg. He left David with food and water. He locked the door. David had been planning his escape for months. He had been working on the padlock with a bent paperclip. Every night, he would pick at the lock for hours. He had learned the mechanism. He could feel the tumblers move. He had patience. He had nothing but time. That night, he succeeded. The lock clicked open. He pulled the chain. It clattered softly. He pushed the door. It swung open. He crept down the attic stairs. The house was dark and silent. He walked past his mother's bedroom. He heard her breathing. He wanted to wake her. He wanted to throw his arms around her. He wanted to tell her everything, but he was terrified. Terrified that Richard would come back and hurt them both. He had to leave. He had to disappear. He walked to the front door. It was unlocked. He stepped out into the cold March night. The air was sharp. He walked 7 miles to the Millbrook bus station. He had a few dollars he had hidden from Richard. He bought a ticket to Pittsburgh. He boarded a Greyhound bus. He was 14 years old, but he was tall for his age. No one asked questions. He was just another face in the crowd. He never looked back. He assumed his mother would think he had been rescued. He assumed Richard would be caught. He didn't know that Richard had already made up a story for Susan. Richard told her David had run away because he was upset about a grounding. He told her it was her fault for being too lenient. He didn't know that Richard would spend the next 29 years living in that house. He didn't know that Richard would seal the room and never speak of it again. David changed his name to Daniel Ross. He told people he was an orphan from the West Coast. He got a job washing dishes in a diner in Pittsburgh. He saved money. He moved to Oregon. He got a GED. He got a job in a warehouse. He worked his way up to supervisor. He built a life. He never told anyone his real name. He never called his mother. He was too afraid. He thought Richard would find him. He thought Richard would kill him. For 32 years he lived in silence, always looking over his shoulder. In 2026, the Miller house was sold. Susan had moved to a nursing home in 2021. Richard had died in his sleep in 2023. The estate sold the property to Emily and Mark. The realtor mentioned a missing child from decades ago, but she downplayed it. She said it was an old story. She didn't mention the locked room. She didn't know about it. Emily and Mark wanted to renovate the attic. They wanted to turn it into a master bedroom. They hired Frank and Pete. On a Thursday morning, Frank started removing the plaster. He hit the wall and heard the wrong sound. He exposed the door. When the police arrived, Sergeant Cole recognized the significance. He called the FBI. Agent Martinez arrived and examined the room. She found the journal. She read the entries. She assigned a team to Oregon. They found Daniel Ross. The FBI agents knocked on his door on a rainy Tuesday morning. Daniel opened the door. He saw the badges. He stepped back. He didn't speak. He walked to his sofa and sat down. He asked for water. He drank it slowly. He asked, "Is he dead?" Agent Martinez nodded. "Richard Miller died in 2023. Daniel closed his eyes. He let out a breath. He nodded. He began to cry. He cried for a long time. The agents waited. They gave him space. Then he told his story. He told them about the room, the years of captivity, the punishments, the fear. He told them about the escape, the bus trip, the shelters, the false identity. He told them about the years of silence. He told them he had always wanted to go back, but he was terrified. He thought Richard would kill him. He thought Richard would kill his mother, too. Martinez showed him a recent photo of Susan. She was 78. She was frail. She had dementia. She lived in a nursing home in Harrisburg. She spent most days in a wheelchair. She often asked for her son. The staff had been trained to tell her he was coming soon. She never stopped waiting. David stared at the photo. He touched it with his fingertips. "Does she remember me?" he asked. Martinez said, "She remembers the boy. She may not recognize you as a man, but she will know you are her son." David said, "I want to see her." The FBI arranged a reunion. It took 2 weeks. David had to be psychologically prepared. Susan had to be told. The nursing home staff consulted a psychologist. They decided to inform Susan in stages. First, they showed her old photos of David. She recognized him. She said, "That's my baby." Then they told her he had been found. She asked, "Where was he?" They said he had been in a room. She didn't understand. She asked if he was coming home. They said yes. On the day of the reunion, David flew from Portland to Harrisburg. He had not seen his mother in over 32 years. He had avoided her all that time. He was afraid she would hate him. He was afraid she would blame him for disappearing. He didn't know she had blamed herself every single day. He took a taxi to the nursing home. He walked to the front door. He stopped. He turned back. He took a deep breath. He walked inside. The staff led him to the day room. Susan was sitting by the window. She was wearing a blue dress, the same color she had worn on the day he vanished. The staff had helped her pick it out. David walked toward her. His legs were weak. He knelt beside her wheelchair. He took her hands. They were thin and veined. He said, "Mom, I'm home." Susan looked at him. She squinted. She studied his face. She touched his cheek. She said, "You're tall." He laughed. He cried. He put his head in her lap. She stroked his hair. She said, "I knew you would come back. I always knew." They stayed like that for a long time. The staff wept. The FBI agents stood in the hallway. They gave the family privacy. After an hour, David asked her if she remembered anything. She said she remembered the basement. She said she remembered his video game. She said she remembered the police. She didn't remember Richard's involvement. She had blocked it out. David didn't tell her everything. He didn't tell her about the room. He didn't tell her about the years of captivity. He didn't want to hurt her. He said he had run away. He said he had been scared. He said he was sorry. She said she forgave him. She said she had never stopped loving him. The local news covered the reunion. A reporter interviewed David outside the nursing home. He said, "I wish I had called sooner. I wish I had been stronger, but I was a kid. I was so afraid." He said he was going to visit her every month. He said he would make up for lost time. The sheriff's department held a press conference. Sheriff Danvers announced that the case was officially closed. He read a statement from the FBI. He said Richard Miller was the sole perpetrator. He said the evidence was overwhelming. He said no charges could be filed because the perpetrator was deceased. He said justice, though delayed, had been served. Frank, the contractor, was interviewed by a local newspaper. He said he still had nightmares about the room. He said he would never forget the sight of those drawings on the wall. He said he was glad he had broken through that wall. He said, "That boy deserved to be free, and now he is." David returned to Oregon after a week. He promised to come back every month. He spoke to his mother every night on the phone. She called him David every time. She rarely forgot his name. The final scene took place on a warm September afternoon. David had come back to Millbrook. He had asked to visit the house. The new owners, Emily and Mark, agreed. They met him on the front porch. The porch was exactly as he remembered it. The white railings, the creaky floorboards, the old wooden swing. David sat on the swing. He closed his eyes. He thought about the day he had walked out of that house, a terrified boy in the dark. He thought about the miles he had run. He thought about all the years he had wasted in fear. Susan was brought in a van from the nursing home. She had been growing weaker. The doctor said she didn't have long, but she was alert that day. She smiled when she saw David. He helped her out of the van. He guided her to the porch. They sat together on the swing. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Susan said, "This is where we used to sit. You would read me stories." David nodded. "I remember. You would sing to me." "I don't remember the songs," she said, "but I remember your face." He put his arm around her. She leaned against him. They watched the sun go down. The new owners brought them tea. They all sat together talking about small things, the dog, the garden, the weather. Normal things. Things that had been missing from David's life for decades. The local news reporter came by. She asked for a short interview. David agreed. He said, "I want people to know that you can survive. You can come back. You can find your family. It's never too late." That night, David stayed in a hotel. He visited his mother the next morning. She was tired but happy. He held her hand. She told him she loved him. He told her he loved her too. Richard Miller's name was never spoken again. David returned to Oregon. He resumed his life. He called his mother every day. He visited every month. He told his friends about his past, the true past. He stopped hiding. He started living. The case file was archived. The room in the attic was sealed permanently. The new owners had the door removed and the wall rebuilt. They wanted no reminders. But the story didn't end there. It continued in the hearts of everyone who heard it. It reminded people that the worst secrets can be hidden in plain sight. It reminded them that love can survive even the deepest wounds. And it reminded them that justice, though delayed, is never impossible. There is one more detail that never made the official report. After the reunion, David visited Detective Dan Fowler. Fowler was retired now, living in a small house outside Millbrook. He was 72 years old. He had carried the Miller case with him for over 3 decades. When David knocked on his door, Fowler opened it and stared. He didn't recognize him at first. Then David said, "I'm the Miller boy. I came to thank you." Fowler broke down. He had spent his career convinced he had failed. He had walked the fields, he had interviewed the witnesses, he had requested the search warrant. He had never stopped believing that Richard was guilty. But he had never been able to prove it. He had carried that failure like a stone in his chest. David told him he had done everything right. He said, "You never gave up. You kept looking." That mattered. They sat on Fowler's porch and talked for hours. David told him everything, the room, the years, the escape, the fear. Fowler listened. He asked questions. He took notes. He said, "I should have found you. I should have searched that attic." David shook his head. He was careful. He was clever. No one could have found it. Fowler asked if he had any regrets. David thought for a long time. He said, "I regret not calling her. I regret every day I stayed silent. But I was a kid. I was so scared. I thought he would kill us both." Fowler nodded. He understood. He had seen that kind of fear before. He had interviewed victims. He had seen the way trauma shaped people. He told David he was proud of him. He told him he was strong. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story. They interviewed Fowler. He said, "This is the closure I never thought I'd get. I'm grateful. I'm going to sleep better tonight than I have in 30 years. The community of Millbrook held a small ceremony. They dedicated a bench in the town square to David. The bench had a plaque, "In memory of the years lost and in celebration of the years found. David attended. He sat on the bench. He looked at the square. He remembered walking through it as a child. He remembered the day he vanished. He remembered the day he came back. The ceremony was simple. A few words from the mayor, a few words from Sheriff Danvers, a few words from David. He said, "I'm not here to talk about the past. I'm here to talk about the future. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for lost time. I'm going to be there for my mother. I'm going to live. That's all any of us can do." The crowd applauded. David looked out at the faces. Some were familiar, some were new. He saw Emily and Mark, the new owners of his childhood home. He saw Martha Hayes, now in her 90s, leaning on a cane. He saw Frank Bellamy, the mechanic who had heard the hammering. He saw Frank the contractor, standing in the back, wiping his eyes. He walked to his mother. She was in her wheelchair. She had been brought for the ceremony. She looked tired but happy. He knelt beside her. She touched his face. She said, "I'm so proud of you." He said, "I love you, Mom." She said, "I love you too. I always have. I always will." They went home together. The nursing home staff had prepared a small dinner. They ate in the day room. David fed his mother her soup. She smiled at him. She held his hand. She didn't let go. That night, David called his therapist. He told her about the ceremony. He told her about Fowler. He told her about the bench. He said, "I feel like I can finally breathe." She said, "That's progress. That's healing." The next day, David flew back to Oregon. He had a job to return to. He had friends waiting. He had a life. He called his mother every night. He visited every month. He became a regular presence at the nursing home. The staff adored him. They said he brought light into the room. David started speaking to local schools. He told his story. He talked about resilience. He talked about survival. He talked about the importance of hope. He never used Richard's name. He didn't need to. The story stood on its own. He also started writing a memoir. He called it The Room. He wrote about his childhood. He wrote about his mother. He wrote about the years of captivity. He wrote about the escape. He wrote about the fear that kept him silent. He wrote about the reunion. He wrote about healing. The publisher said it was a story of survival. David said it was a story of love. The memoir was released a year later. It became a bestseller. David did a book tour. He spoke at libraries and bookstores. He appeared on local news programs. He was careful not to sensationalize his story. He kept it simple and honest. He talked about the people who helped him. He talked about the people who never gave up. One interview stuck with him. A young woman asked, "How do you forgive someone who hurt you like that?" David thought for a moment. He said, "I don't forgive him. I don't have to. What I do is let go. I don't carry his weight anymore. It's not mine to carry." He wrote about that moment in his journal. He wrote, "Forgiveness is not the goal. Freedom is, and I am free." The years passed. Susan Miller died in 2029. She was 81 years old. David was with her. He held her hand. He told her he loved her. He told her he was grateful. She smiled. She said, "I always knew you'd come back." She closed her eyes. She was gone. David buried her in the Millbrook Cemetery. The service was small. Family and friends attended. Detective Dan Fowler came. He was 75 by then. He walked with a cane. He stood at the grave and said a prayer. He told David, "She was a good woman. She loved you so much." David nodded. He couldn't speak. He was crying too hard. He placed a stone on her grave. He wrote a note and buried it beside her. The note said, "I'm sorry I was late. I'm sorry I stayed away. But I'm here now. I'll always be here. I love you, Mom." David visited the grave every year. He would sit on the grass and talk to her. He would tell her about his life. He would tell her about his work. He would tell her about his friends. He would tell her he missed her. He always said, "Thank you for never giving up on me." He never remarried. He never had children. He said he couldn't imagine bringing a child into the world after what he had been through. But he was happy. He had friends. He had purpose. He had peace. The Miller house was sold again. Emily and Mark moved to a bigger house. They told David they would never forget him. They said his story had changed their lives. David thanked them. He told them to keep the bench in the town square. The room in the attic was never reopened. The new owners had it sealed permanently. They built a closet over the spot. They wanted no reminders. But David didn't need a reminder. He remembered every detail. He carried it with him. But it didn't weigh him down anymore. It was part of his story, part of who he was. He told his therapist once, "I used to think that room was my prison. Now I think it was just a room. I'm the one who got out. I'm the one who lived." The therapist said, "That's the difference between surviving and thriving. You've done both." David smiled. He said, "I'm still working on it." He was always working on it. Every day he chose to live. Every day he chose to hope. Every day he chose to be grateful. The story of David Miller is a story of survival. It is a story of love. It is a story of justice delayed but not denied. It is a story that reminds us that even in the darkest places, there is light. Even in the deepest pain, there is hope. Even in the longest silence, there is a voice waiting to speak. Thank you for listening. This fictional account was inspired by the very real struggles of families affected by unsolved disappearances. While the case you just heard is not based on any single true event, its themes of loss, survival, and delayed justice echo the experiences of countless individuals. We hope it gave you insight and reflection. If you have thoughts about this story, we'd genuinely like to hear them in the comments. What would you have done if you were David? Would you have ever gone back? Would you have reached out sooner? If you appreciate investigative storytelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Archive 26. We release new reconstructions every week. Until next time, take care of each other.